Hi, my name is Liz Lowe, and I'm a procurement expert working for the Provincial Government of British Columbia. And I'm here to talk to you about the two-page short-form request for proposal. When is it that we're supposed to be using it? When is it used in scope? Keep in mind that if we find out that your particular contract doesn't fit with the SRFP, we do have other options available to you. So let's go through then when we would use the SRFP. First thing to look at is the dollar value of your contract. It needs to be under $250,000. This is a key point to the SRFP. And also, you need to make sure that there's not a CSA or a corporate supply arrangement currently available that you can use that would procure your goods or services that you're looking for. If there is, it's much easier to use the CSA. You simply order from it without having to do a separate procurement process. You also want to look at whether or not a direct award applies. If you're not sure about a direct award, so this is a contract that's given to one vendor without competition, you can always check the Policy and Procedures Manual at section 6.3.3, and it will tell you what is allowed in policy for a direct award. Now that doesn't mean that you can't use the SRFP even if direct award applies. It just means that you don't have to. You also want to be looking at the contract format. You need to know exactly what the form of contract is going to be before using the SRFP. So this means, for example, if you're buying something that's going to include software licensing, you probably don't know what that license is going to look like when you are doing your procurement process. And the SRFP, therefore, would not be the appropriate form to use. So you need to know what contract format you're going to be using in its entirety, all of it, in order to use the SRFP. You also want to be looking at evaluating more than just price. Sometimes it makes perfect sense to use just a price evaluation process. So this means that the only thing that you're really looking at that differentiates one submission from another is the price that's being offered at. In this case, we have other tools that are available that are easier to use that will do exactly that for you. Look strictly at price. The SRFP looks at more than just price. You also want to be looking at what it is you're buying. The SRFP is intended to be used primarily for services. Now that doesn't mean you can't use it for goods, but if you're buying goods through an RFP process, you need to ask yourself, what is it that you're gaining that's making it worth the extra money that you're spending? And a lot of times there are cases where that makes total sense and an SRFP is exactly the way to go, but you do need to ask yourself that question. And finally, you need to be looking at those procurement opportunities that are of a lower exposure. And I know that sounds a little vague, so let's step through what do we mean by lower and higher exposures. So what do we mean by kind of exposure? We have lower exposure and higher exposure contracts. So let's go through each of the elements for these. We'll start with the services themselves. Is this something we've purchased before? Something that we know well, we can describe easily? That's a lower exposure. If these are new services or we're doing substantive changes to how we've done this before, that's a higher exposure. Then look to the scope. Can we define the scope well? Can we put that easily into our SRFP? Or is the scope more vague? Perhaps we're looking for a solution to a problem and there's multiple ways that a vendor could solve the problem for us. That would be a higher exposure. And then we look to standards and performance measures. Do we have any? Can we reference them? If so, that's a lower exposure. If there aren't any, that's a higher exposure. Even if you're planning them now or you plan to do them in the future, if they don't exist at the time of your SRFP, it's a higher exposure. Then there's the requirement to describe what you're looking for within the two-page limit of your SRFP. Can we do that? Or is it just not possible? Now be careful with this one because we can use things such as website URLs and appendices to help us describe what it is we're looking for. So for example though, if it turns out that you've got a 300-page document on how the services are to be delivered, kind of don't want to include that as an appendix. It defeats the purpose of a two-page RFP. Then look to how it is you're going to be managing questions. Can you do this through written addenda that are posted on BC Bid or sent to your selected proponents just in writing? Or do you need a little bit more? Perhaps a proponents meeting where you can have face-to-face time with your interested vendors. Or you need a shortlist process such as an interview or demonstrations. That would be higher exposure. Lower exposure, we're only going to be evaluating one aspect of experience. So experience typically is either the organization itself, a particular individual, such as a consultant, or a team of individuals that are going to be delivering the services. For a lower exposure, we're going to choose one of those categories, and that's the experience that we'll evaluate. On the other hand, higher exposure would be the need to evaluate more than one. Perhaps you just can't possibly decide between one proponent and another unless you evaluate both the organization and the key people that will be delivering the services. That's higher exposure. And finally, there's price. Can we describe clearly what it is we want price to include and how we're going to be evaluating price? That's lower exposure. But if price is complex, requiring a lot of descriptions that are hard to understand, that's a higher exposure. But don't confuse this with the number of prices that you're asking for. It's certainly possible to have more than one price in an SRFP as long as each price can be clearly described and evaluated. Now, what you're likely going to find in your contract is some of the elements of higher exposure apply and some of lower exposure apply. That's to be expected. What you want to look to is where is the majority of these elements falling. There are 7 elements, so which one are we hitting 4 or more? That's where your score is going to lie. If you've got 4 or more higher exposure, that means that the SRFP is probably not going to work for this particular opportunity. If you've got 4 or more as lower exposure, that means that the SRFP likely will work for you and it would be in scope. The other thing to keep in mind is that your procurement file is going to require documentation on how your contract meets or doesn't meet the scope for SRFP. So it's perfectly fine for you to decide that your contract under $250,000 is out of scope, but just make sure you've got that in the file just in case somebody asks later. So in summary then, for determining whether or not the SRFP is for you, consider the 6 criteria identified at the beginning of this clip. Those 6 criteria are all yes or no's. If any of them are not hit, if any of them don't apply, that means that the SRFP is out of scope for this particular contract. Then remember the 7th criterion, lower exposure. Go through the table and score what is lower exposure, what is higher exposure to determine where you fit in that spectrum. If your score is 4 or higher in higher exposure, that means that the SRFP is not for you and you need to be looking at other options. So if you're looking for additional resources, here's a few thoughts for you. You can visit the Corporate Supply Arrangement website to find out if there's a CSA that exists that's going to meet your needs. You can also look at various resources available for the short form RFP. There's more videos available, and we have templates, as well as a writer's guide and a proponent's guide. There's also the Procurement Services website that has a lot of information on other types of procurements that may be useful or applicable for your particular needs. And finally, we also have the Procurement Community of Practice, which is a community of people who are in the procurement and contract management field that share ideas and documents and lots of other information that you may find useful. Are you not sure where it is you can find all of these websites? Hang on one sec and we're going to give you those URLs.